Hello and welcome to your next Life Sciences lesson. This is a section which I know many of you actually find quite boring and difficult to learn. But it's actually all quite logical, and hopefully by the end of this lesson you will understand this particular section and be able to see how everything fits together. What we are going to be looking at today is the different types of plant tissue. If all plant cells are the same, when you eat an apple, why don't they feel the same? Some bits are hard, some bits are soft. And the reason is those are all plant cells, but they have all been specialized to be able to carry out a different function in keeping the plant alive. And what we are going to be looking at is the different types of cells that keep a plant alive and what they look like. We are going to be looking at the three main types of plant tissues and what they do. First one is epidermal tissue, which is the skin surrounding a plant, but like your skin. The second one is the conducting or vascular tissue, which is a bit like your blood. It takes substances around the plant. Then, where there are no other cells, we have different types of ground tissue filling in the spaces. To be able to understand tissues, you need to remember the different parts of a cell and what these different parts of the cell actually do. If we look at this cell, we can see it's got a cell wall. And the cell wall is what gives the plant support. Some cells, for example, in the wood of a tree, the cell walls are very, very thick because their job is supporting the tree. Inside cells, we have these green things, and they are chloroplasts. And they would be found in places like leaves because their job is photosynthesis. Most cells have a vacuole, and in that vacuole there would be dissolved sugars and things like that. So depending on where the cell is and what its function is, it can have a thicker wall. It can have more chloroplasts. It can have bigger vacuoles. To be able to understand what's going on, we need to understand the concepts that you have already done in class. I'm just going to revise them for you. You've learnt about mitosis, which is when cells divide to form many cells. You can think of those cells as little baby cells. As the cells get bigger, they become specialized, and we say they differentiate. When they become specialized so that they can carry out a particular function. And when a whole lot of cells become specialized to carry out a function, they form a tissue. And these are the three main types of tissue in a plant: epidermal tissue, ground tissue, and conducting or vascular tissue. To understand tissues, we need to think of it in practical terms. For example, eating an apple. Eating your vegetables which your parents tell you you must eat. Sometimes they're delicious to eat and sometimes they're a little bit tough. That depends on what the cells in that particular vegetable are like. For example, young vegetables are tender because they don't have thick cell walls. Old vegetables are tougher because they have thick cell walls. Different parts, let's say of an apple, have different thicknesses of walls depending on what function they need to carry out. And that is what you need to think of to understand plant tissues. Where is the cell and what is it actually going to be doing? The first type of cells we're looking at are cells that have just been formed by mitosis. They are tiny cells, we can think of them as baby cells, and they are going to grow up and become specialized. They are found in the tips of roots and stems, and we're going to have a look at what do these meristematic or baby cells look like. Tiny little cell, just been formed. Cell that is busy dividing by mitosis. Small cells, no air spaces between them, and if we look at their walls, their walls are actually quite thin. Once these cells have been formed, they grow up. They become specialized and they become what we call permanent tissue, where they are specialized to carry out a specific function. And the permanent tissues are the ones that we're going to spend most of the rest of this lesson having a look at. So, permanent tissues, once cells have been formed, they differentiate. And once they are permanent tissues, they cannot divide. So you can think of them as grown-up cells. And depending on what their function is, they would look different. If we look at this picture, this is a picture of a root cut open, and we can see the cells on the outside have a particular appearance. The cells in the inside look different, and those right in the center look completely different. And that is because these are the three different types of permanent tissue that we are going to be looking at in the next segment of this lesson. We're now going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to be looking at all of these different types of permanent tissues. Welcome back after your break, and I hope your brains have had a bit of a break so you are ready for the next section of work that we are going to be covering. Before the break, we looked at the different types of permanent tissue, which are tissues that stay, once they've been formed, they stay the same and they carry out a very important function in keeping the plant alive. As we investigate these tissues, think about eating fruit, such as an apple or a mango, because as you eat those, you're going to be eating all these different types of tissues. First type of tissue we're looking at is something that we peel off most plants. For example, when you're cooking potatoes, you peel potatoes. When you're cooking carrots, you peel carrots. And that is because the outer layer of any plant part is usually much tougher than the inner layers, because its function is to protect the cells inside. And this is the first tissue we're looking at, which is epidermal tissue, forming a skin around the different parts of the plant. If we look under a microscope, that is what the cells would look like. Fairly small cells, but the important part is they have got a lining. Most of them have a lining called a cuticle, which protects them. You know, when you take an apple and you rub an apple, it looks so shiny. That is because by rubbing the apple, you have smoothed the waxy cuticle so that you can see that it's actually nice and shiny. The cells underneath that often have a thickened wall, because if their job is protection, they need to have an extra thick wall to be able to do their job. We find them on the outside of all plant parts to protect and keep in water. But you couldn't live with a plastic bag over your head. In the same way, a plant can't live if it's totally isolated from its environment. So in certain parts of the plant, you will find special cells which take in the substances a plant needs. We're going to have a look at two of these. First one is something called a guard cell, which is found in leaves. They're actually really quite cute little cells, because this is what they look like. Two cells next to each other with a little hole in the middle. And that hole is so that they can take in the gas needed for photosynthesis. And the cutest thing about these is they can open or close, just like somebody's kissing you, just like lips that are busy kissing you. These are found in the outer layer of the leaves and the stems, because that is where substances need to be taken in. Apart from gas, what else do plants need to take in? If you have a pot plant, what do? You water the pot plant. Where do you put the water? You put it in the soil, because in the soil are the roots, and the roots are specialized to take in water. And they can do this because they have specialized root hair cells. This is the surface view of a leaf with some of the stomata, and you can see the opening between the two guard cells where the gas can go into and out of the leaf. Also notice that these epidermal cells are very, very closely packed, and there are no air spaces between them, because the only way air can get into the plant is through the stomata. And this is such a cute picture because it shows what these stomata actually look like, and it clearly shows the pore in the center. It also shows the fact that around the pore is a very thick wall surrounding the pore, whereas the walls on the outside of the two guard cells are much, much thinner. But air isn't the only thing that plants have to take in. For example, if you have a pot plant, you have to put water on the pot plant to keep it alive. And where do you put the water? You put the water on the soil. And that is because in the soil are the roots, and the roots have specialized cells whose function it is to absorb water. And these are the next specialized epidermal cells we're looking at. They are called root hairs. And this is a picture of a seed that is starting to germinate, and you can see all the thousands of little outgrowths it has, and those are all single-celled tiny root hairs. And here is an enlarged picture of a root hair. I'm outlining it in red. It's a cell of the epidermis, and it has this outgrowth. And the outgrowth is where water can be absorbed. And the root hair increases the surface area so that there is more space for the plant to take in water. And this is obviously found in roots. Just underneath the epidermis are lots of different types of cells, and we call these ground tissue. And they have different thicknesses of walls, they're different sizes, and they have different contents depending on what their specific function is. And we are going to have a look at the 3 different types of ground tissue. This is a photograph taken under a microscope, and we can see different types of cells. We can see big cells with thin walls. We can see other cells with thick walls, and these are simply the different types of ground tissue. These big fat ones are called parenchyma cells. And these ones with the very thick walls, obviously for protection and support, those are called Sclerenchyma. And there is another type we will look at later, which has walls that are not quite as thick as Sclerenchyma. And these are all found in different parts of the plant to carry out different functions. First ones we're looking at are parenchyma. Now, you have no idea how many parenchyma cells you eat when you eat your supper. Because when you eat a potato is made of parenchyma cells. When you eat an apple, the apple is made of parenchyma cells. When you eat a carrot, when you eat a mango, any plant part you eat is made up mainly of parenchyma cells. And they are just ordinary cells. They're probably closest to the drawing that you did when you learnt about the cells. So, what are these parenchyma cells like? They're large and they have thin walls. Okay, as you can see there's the cell, there's its wall. And wow, look, it's got lots of green things in it. Those green things would be chloroplasts. Then they are generally loosely packed because there is usually some space between them. Now, if we look at this one, what do you think the function of this particular cell is? It's got lots and lots of green things, so obviously its function would be photosynthesis. But not all parenchyma cells look exactly like that. Here are 3 different types of parenchyma cells. They're found in different parts of a plant, and depending on what their function is, they would have different contents. For example, here we have cells filled with chloroplasts. That's obviously in the leaves for photosynthesis. What we have here, that is your potato. Because inside those cells, those little purpley things, those are the starch grains, and you should know that when you eat potatoes, you're eating a lot of starch. This picture shows very nicely how there are spaces between the cells. Then the other type of cell, if we have a look here, these are storage cells. Can you see the spaces between them? That's important for gaseous exchange. But this cell looks empty, and that is because it's got a huge vacuole, large vacuoles filled with sugar. So that would be in your apple. Here you would see those purple things filled with starch. They are your leucoplasts. And these would all be found in different parts of the plant. Parenchyma cells have thin walls. They're great for storage, but they're really, really bad for support. So where a plant needs support, it would need to have cells with walls that are thickened. And there are 2 types of that. And the first one we're having a look at is something called Collenchyma, where the cell walls are thickened in the corners. If we have a look there, we can see the corners, and that is where the cell walls are extra thick. They also don't have any air spaces. And because they've got thick walls, their function is for support. So they would obviously be found wherever support is needed. They're often found just underneath the epidermis, and this is a picture. There are the Collenchyma cells with their thickened corners, and there we have the epidermal cells. Then, if those walls aren't thick enough, if the cell or if the plant really needs something firm to support it, we can have cells where the entire cell wall is extra thick, and this is called Sclerenchyma cells, and they have very thick walls, and also they have no cell contents. Because their walls are very thick, they do a wonderful job of support and protection. For example, grass stems, nutshells, pear flesh, and mango pips. And let me tell you, Sclerenchyma, you wouldn't like to eat it because it really is tough. Some Sclerenchyma cells are elongated with their thick walls. Others are short fat cells, and this example is found in pear flesh. And if you ever eat a pear, you sometimes find those hard, gritty bits, and those are special Sclerenchyma cells called stone cells. Why are they in a pear? I don't know. But the ones that are found in grass stems are actually very good for support. If we look at this picture, let's see if we can identify. Here we have cells with thin walls. What type of ground tissue would they be? Which is the type of ground tissue with thin walls? Parenchyma. If we look at these cells, the walls are thickened, but only in the corners, so that would be Collenchyma. And if we look here, the walls are thickened all the way around, so that would be Sclerenchyma. Welcome back. We had started looking at the different types of tissues found in plants, and we had covered 2 of the important sections. For example, we had looked at epidermal tissue, and then we had looked at the ground tissue, the tissue that fills the space. We had looked at parenchyma, big cells, food stored inside them with thin walls. Collenchyma, which has walls that are thickened in corners, and Sclerenchyma, which had walls that were thickened all the way around. The last type of tissue we need to look at is the conducting tissue. And you can think of this is like your arteries and veins. It carries substances around your body. And in plants, there are 2 different types. One carries water and one carries food. And we are going to have a look at those 2 different types of conducting or vascular tissue. So the first one is called xylem. And this is a picture taken under a microscope, and that is a xylem vessel, and the hole in the middle would be where it transports water. Water's got to go from the roots up the plant. The leaves use the water to make food, and the food has to go back down to the root. So the other type of vascular or conducting tissue is found here, and that is called phloem, and its job is to transport dissolved organic foods. So one transports substances up the stem, the other transports substances down the stem. And we're looking at the first one now, which is called xylem. Now, you can think of xylem as straws joined end to end. And they form very, very long tubes. It's a bit like you joining 4 or 5 straws together and drinking cool drink out of a glass that is on the floor. To be able to transport substances, they're cells, but they don't have any cross walls because the walls would simply get in the way. They have no cell contents because the cell contents, nucleus, vacuole, things like that, they would simply get in the way. They also have walls that are thickened to prevent collapse. And this picture here shows us that thing there. Okay, that is a xylem vessel. There's another one, and there is another one. And you can see that they have thickenings around them to try and keep them open. It's a bit like if you've sat on a straw or stood on a straw, it's very difficult to suck anything up through a straw because the straw has actually collapsed. So the main function is water movement, but because they have thickened walls, they also carry out the job of support. And they would be found in all parts of the plant, the roots to absorb, the stems to move up, and the leaf veins to take the water to the cells. This is another microscopic picture of xylem vessels in the stem. Okay, and here I'm outlining in blue. You can see there's one xylem vessels, and it's got thickenings to keep it open. This is another xylem vessel. It has thickenings to keep it open. And here are diagrams of those 3 different types, or those 4 different types of xylem vessels, just to show the fact that they have different types of thickenings. Then, to get food from the leaf back down to the roots, because the roots, they have to live, they need food, is a special type of tissue called phloem. They're also elongated and they have thin walls, but the cells don't join together. They've got these little things between them. And those are called sieve plates. So they are joined end to end to form long tubes called sieve tubes, and they have cross walls with pores, and those pores are called sieve plates. So that substances can move down through the sieve tubes and they can pass through those sieve plates. The question now is, if they had a nucleus here, what would happen to that nucleus as substances move down? That nucleus would be pushed out of the cell. So it's not practical for the phloem cells to have nuclei, so what they do is they've got little cells next to them. And those little cells are called companion, so they have no nuclei, and next to them they have companion cells with nuclei, and the companion cells basically control what is happening in the sieve tube. Their function is to transport food, and of course they would also be found in the same parts, the roots, the stems, and the leaf veins, because the food's got to go back down. This is a photograph taken under a microscope of xylem and phloem. You can clearly see the big xylem vessels here with their very, very thick walls. And if you look, they kind of form almost like a little cross. This is found in a root. So this is where the water would be moving up the stem. This section here, okay, that is phloem. And if you look at the xylem cells, they're actually very big and you can clearly see their thick walls. The phloem cells have got thin walls, but what gives it away is these little cells between. That's a sieve tube element, and that is a companion cell. So you can identify phloem quite easily because it's got biggish sieve tubes and much, much smaller companion cells. That's the best way to identify phloem. This is a comparison of xylem and phloem to show the difference between them. First of all, these arrows show that in xylem, the water always flows upwards. It also shows that the walls are quite thick and there are no cross walls because the cross walls would simply get in the way. This is phloem, okay, and phloem has a problem because food travels down to the roots, but at the beginning of spring, food also has to travel back up to the buds so that new leaves can be formed. So in phloem, we have at certain times of the year substances flowing upwards, and at certain times of the year substances flowing downwards, and that is why you need those little companion cells, so there is some type of control over the movement of substances. So what we've now looked at is we've looked at the three main different types of permanent tissue: epidermal, ground, and vascular tissue, with all the different types of cells that are found in each category. I hope this has helped you understand what's going on. It's now time for an ad break. Welcome back. We've looked at all the different types of specialized plant tissues found in plants. What we're going to look at now is we're going to look at, well, where in a plant are all these different parts found? And that comes under the heading of the anatomy of a plant. And way back in primary school, you should have learnt that a plant consists of roots, stems, and leaves. Now, which tissues do we find in roots, stems, and leaves? That depends on, well, what are the roots there for? What is their function? What are the leaves there for? What is their function? It's all very, very logical. So the first thing we need to look at is what is the function of these different parts of the plant, and we will link that to, well, which types of tissues need to be in that part of the plant to actually carry out that particular function. So, first of all, root. What does a root do? Stem. What does the stem do? Why do leaves exist? And lastly, what is a flower there for? So, let's have a look. Roots, and this should be from primary school. You should know that roots go into the ground for two reasons: anchorage and absorbing water. Stems are for supporting the plant, and they also need to make sure that the substances the leaves need actually get to the leaves. So, the roots are there for anchorage and water absorption. Oh, and food storage. Think of a carrot. It stores food. Stems are there for support to hold the plant up and transport water to the leaves and food down from the leaves. The leaf has got the most important function of photosynthesis, because that is what gives us food. It also undergoes gaseous exchange, and plants lose water in something called transpiration. And the flower, which we're not looking at in this section, is there for reproduction. So what we need to do is we need to say, okay, this is what a plant looks like. What tissues would we necessarily find in each part of the plant? Remember, we've done tissues. We know what they do. So the next thing is we're going to look at, well, let's link with what we know tissues do with what the function of the different parts of the plant are. So I'll give you a minute or so to think of, well, will a root, what will it need? Will it need meristematic cells? Will it need xylem? Will it need phloem? Think of any type of tissues that we've done that would be needed for the plant to be able to carry out all of these different functions. For example, does it need to be able to divide? Does it need a protective covering? If so, which coverings? Does it need a cuticle? Does it need parenchyma? Does it need collenchyma? Does it need sclerenchyma? Does it need cells with thickened walls? Does it need xylem and phloem? I think we can say right at the beginning, it definitely needs xylem and phloem. So, if we look now, yes, plants do need meristematic cells to grow and to branch. If we look at this, there are branch roots, and it's the branch roots which actually do the anchoring of the plant. And that's why it's difficult to pull out weeds, because they've got all these branches that anchor them in the soil. Next, does it need epidermal cells? Yes, it would, but does it need a cuticle? It's underground. A waxy cuticle prevents drying out. It's not going to dry out under the ground. But does it need root hairs? Oh yes, very definitely right near the root tip to do the absorbing. Does it need parenchyma? Yes, because we have discussed that one of the functions of the roots is to store food, for example, a carrot. Then, do they need collenchyma and sclerenchyma? No, they're in the soil. They're supported by the soil. They're protected by the soil. So you won't find collenchyma or sclerenchyma in roots, but you will definitely find xylem and phloem, because those are integral to the functioning of the roots. So, let's have a look at this. This is a microscopic view of a root. I know it looks pretty confusing, but quite honestly, we will go bit by bit, and hopefully that will help you be able to work out what's going on. So, first of all, to get this picture, we have cut the root across. That is something called a cross section. And it's a bit like if you use carrots and you cut a carrot across. What you're seeing is something like a carrot cut across. If you think of a carrot, this central portion here, in a carrot, that would be in a slightly yellowish color. And all the cells inside it are much, much tougher. And that is where all the vascular tissue is found. Let's have a look and see what we can identify. First of all, these are easy to identify because those are root hairs. We've just done root hairs, so we know their main function is increase the surface area for absorption. Here, those cells would be what type of cells? Those cells would be epidermal cells. They're on the outside of the plant, and they are there for protection. Then, these great big cells here, those are ordinary parenchyma cells, which is where the food is stored. And in the center, the star-like structure here, it's got great big cells in it. What do you think that is? That is the xylem. Now, where there's xylem, there's also got to be phloem. And that is where the phloem is found. So, even though we've never looked at the root before, just by thinking about where the different cells are and which particular type of cells need to be in the root, we can get a pretty good idea of what it looks like. So, if we have a look at this, this is a diagram of the cross-section of the stem showing the root hairs, showing the xylem and phloem in the center, showing the parenchyma, and then there are also two other layers which we haven't discussed before. Okay, and one of those is called the endodermis. Let's have a look at that word. Dermis, you've heard of that before. Dermis is the word for skin. Endo is the word for inside. So while the epidermis on the outside is the outer skin, the endodermis is what we call the inner skin. And it's basically there to control water as it moves into the root. Now, I'm sure looking at that, you're already feeling confused because there is a lot of detail. What we sometimes do to make it a little bit easier is instead of showing exactly what the cells look like, we do something called a plan diagram or a line diagram. And this is much easier to interpret because all it does is it shows you where the different types of cells are found. It doesn't show you exactly what they look like, it shows you where they occur. And this diagram is a plan diagram or a line diagram, and all it does is it shows the different areas where the different types of cells are found. So on the outside, we've got the root hairs and the epidermis, then the cortex, which is the parenchyma cells, and in the center, we have the vascular tissue, and the vascular tissue is the conducting tissue, which is xylem and phloem, and that is found in the center, and that is called the vascular cylinder or the vascular stele. Now, once you've looked at the plan, it will be a little bit easier to actually have a look at the detailed diagram because you will be able to see where the different cells occur. You need to be able to label a diagram like this if it is ever given to you, and you need to be able to identify the different tissues and say what their function is. For example, root hair, absorb water. Epidermis, protection. Parenchyma cells, storage. Air spaces between them, substances inside them. In the center of the root, you have the vascular tissue with the xylem in the form of a star and the phloem in between the arms of the star. Remember, this is called the vascular cylinder or vascular stele. The only one which is going to be a bit tricky is this one here, which is the endodermis or inner skin, which controls the movement of water into or out of the central area of the vascular cylinder. I hope that what we have done has helped you in your understanding of the different types of plant tissues and where they are found in a plant, and more importantly, why they are found in the plant. See you next time.